This is Eclipse, and this is the Eclipse development environment, and we're going to use this to create our first application. Now, as I'm doing that, I'm going to create the application. I'm going to explain exactly what I'm doing as I go. The application that we're creating is pretty simple. We're going to start with a Hello World application, and we're going to add a little bit to it. Now, Hello World is the first application that people generally create when they're developing for a new operating system or developing in a new language. So I'm going to start by hitting the File menu. I'm going to start by hitting the File menu, choosing New, and Android Project. And now you can see the new Android Project setup screen. Now this setup screen is useful because this is where we're going to set up everything that's going to be part of our application and kind of the actual guts of our application. And if we make incorrect choices here, we really could be causing ourselves problems later. So we're going to start with a project name. I'm just going to call this NetCom Hello World. I think the C in NetCom is lowercase. There we go. And I'm going to create the project in my current workspace, the default location right here. The location is simply where are the files for my project going to be stored on my local hard drive. This is an important choice, but you just want to be consistent. Now, if you have a PC or Linux, that path may look different, but the options are essentially the same. Now, here comes the first really critical choice. What Android or Google APIs are we going to support? Starting with version 1.5, which is the oldest, if we support 1.5, well, we're really maximizing the number of devices that will be able to run our application, because anybody with 1.5, 1.6, 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, etc. is going to be able to run our application. But we're also limiting the number of APIs that are available to us. I'm going to use it Android 2.2. Now notice we have Android 2.2 as part of the Android open source project and then the Google APIs. If we're going to be using the Google APIs like Google Maps, we're going to check that off. I'm not actually going to use them, but I'm going to check it off anyway. So now we're going to set our application properties. I'm going to set the application name to Hello World from Mark. This is just completely arbitrary. And next we've got to set up a package name. Now, if those of you who are familiar with programming, packages are simply basically file structures that hold our applications. And in Java, we use packages to kind of organize that. It also prevents what are called namespace collisions, where you have perhaps the same objects from different libraries with the same name. So typically, package names start with like the end of a URL. So we're going to do com.netcom.android.webinar. And now I'm going to create an activity. If anybody actually has a degree in computer science, you may have done something called creating a state machine. And this lovely assignment involved you basically diagramming the different states of your application. You might also call these screens. An activity is equivalent to a state or screen. Let's say we had a typical, I don't know, trivia game that we were building. Well, the different activities of the trivia game might include playing the game itself, reading the instructions, displaying the high scores. So those are all activities that are associated with the game. So we're going to create an initial activity, and we're going to call it greeting. Minimum SDK version, I'm just going to correspond with the API level. That's going to be 8. Now, once I click Finish, what's going to happen is the Eclipse environment is going to create the outline of my application. You can see that over here on the left. And we've got a number of files that have been generated. I want to spend a minute and go over these because these are the actual foundation for every Android application. So let's open these babies up here. We've got a source folder, then we've got our package folder, we've got a generated folder in our package folder, we've got the Google APIs, and we've got resources. And then we've got something called the manifest and default.properties. So let's start at the top. Our master folder is NetCom Hello World. That's our application. And then we have our package, which I call com.netcom.android.webinar. And in here, we've got a file called greeting.java. This is actually the initial Java file based on the initial activity that runs our application. I'll go over this Java file here in a few minutes, but this looks pretty much like any other Java file that you might have seen. We've got a class, and then we've got a function or a method that was within the class, and this method happens to override another method from the parent class. Again, that requires some Java to fully understand, but for right now, let's just agree that this is our Java file that's going to be part of our application. Okay, and then we've got this r.java file, which is part of the generated folder. I'm going to open this up. I'd like everyone to raise your right hand and promise you will never touch this file. This file is actually generated by Eclipse itself, and what it does, you can see right up here, auto-generated file, do not modify. This file actually has links to all of the objects that are part of our application. This can get quite lengthy if we've got an application that's got a number of components to it. We'll take a look at this file again a little bit later and as it grows, but you can see we've got here a hex representation of the icon, which will be the icon that's part of the distribution of our file, the main, which is where our application starts, something called app name and hello, both of which are strings. Let's close that up. That'll become more understandable in a minute. We've then got the Google APIs. The first is the Android jar. You might be familiar with the term jar. Jar is a Java archive, and this contains all of the Android package. I'm going to pause for a minute and answer a question that Daniel's thrown to me. Does he need to select Android 2.2 when I created the project? We do need to select a version of Android when we create the project. I selected 2.2. I could have selected 1.5 to have more devices be compatible, but then I would have had fewer parts of this API, which you see here, available. So you can see here, these are the actual classes or packages that we'd work with. The classes are inside them to create our applications. For example, if we were going to work with OpenGL, here are the OpenGL classes. Those are used for graphics. If we were to use speech, here are the speech classes. And all of these are documented at developer.android.com. So we have full instructions. Here is the database, the SQLite database. Here is Bluetooth. So these are an archive which basically includes the entire Android library. I'm going to close that up. We don't interact directly with these files, but they're part of our distribution of our final application. We then have resource files. And our resource files are basically different elements that are part of our application, but not part of the application code strictly. So here I've got the icon. Now you notice I have three drawable files, HDPI, LDPI, and MDPI. And this is to deal with the different available screen resolutions in Android. So we have an HDPI, which is high DPI, low DPI for lower resolution, and then something in the middle. And right now the only thing in here is our icon. I'm going to go ahead and look at the layout file. And the layout file is an XML file. XML is just a data carrying language, which simply has the layout of our application, or the different elements. Right now our application only has two elements in the layout. It's got a linear layout, which is a container, and then a text view, which is used to hold text. The text view itself now holds a string called hello. We can click down here at layout and get a visual version of the layout. And you can see here's hello world greeting. Now this string came from, again, if we look at the XML, this resource, @string hello. So here is the string resource, and in here is hello, hello world greeting. Let's change this to Mark is very good looking, which you all saw in my picture. I'm sure you agree. So we'll save that. And now if we go back and look at the main XML again and look at the main layout, this is a picture of what it would look like in the device. It's actually changed this string. Another very important file is the Android manifest. The Android manifest is an XML that's read by the Android device and by the Android device store, and it has information that's critical about your application, including the actual different activities that are part of our application. So here's an activity called greeting. Here is the filters that make this activity the launch activity. So this is actually all we need to launch our Hello World program on the device itself. Now again, the program is simply going to display what you see here, but we're going to use an emulator to display the information or display the application. So we actually have an Android emulator that's part of the package. So I'm going to create a new emulator. I'll call this the NetCom emulator. The emulator's got to target a certain Google API, and here again it's critical that we chose the right one. We chose 2.2, so we want our emulator to be a 2.2. The size of the SD card, I'll just go with 1028. And here, if we wanted to, we could adjust different elements of the hardware. For example, we could adjust whether it has SD card support, the accelerometer. We could adjust battery support, camera support, the amount of RAM the device has. We're not going to make any of these adjustments, but we certainly could to emulate different types of devices. So we're going to create the AVD, that's the Android Virtual Device, and that's the actual device we're going to run our application on. It takes just a moment or two for this to be created. Once it's created, you'll see it listed in the list of available devices, which will appear right here. Once the device is running, our next step will be to actually distribute our application to the device. So I'm going to close that guy here, and I'm going to distribute the application to the device in debug mode. So I'm going to create a new configuration, which is going to run the Hello World application. And we're going to run the NetCom Hello World project, and we've got to choose a target device. We're going to use the device I just created, the NetCom emulator. And now I'm going to click Debug. And what's going to happen here is an actual Android device is going to be created and is going to run here on my machine. So what I'm doing is I'm running a Linux machine, which is the Android device, on my Mac, and right now it's actually creating the Android device. Now, this boot is one of the things that takes a few minutes. It takes several minutes for this to boot, so while this is booting, you can kind of watch, and I'll see if I can answer just a couple of questions that are here. So here's a question, and it's, does the adoption of HTML5 pose a threatening alternative to native applications, especially if connectivity is assumed? So HTML5 is the latest version of HTML. It is not yet an adopted W3C standard, and in my opinion, the answer to your question is no. HTML5 is not robust enough to do what a lot of these native applications do. These are full applications running on a computer, and that computer being the Linux or Android device. So HTML5 hasn't developed to the point really where it can be a threat. You can create Android applications using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, but they're not nearly as robust as what can be created as native applications. Great question. Another question. While this is still booting here, you can see the screen has changed and it has the Android opening here. If I want to develop my independent app, which one should I choose, iPhone or Android? Any ideas on future apps which can be developed? Well, I'll take the first part of that, iPhone versus Android. Really, I think you should develop for both. Right now, they're both about half of the market, and if you can, you know, while the iPhone store is better for monetizing, the Android store is better for getting your application out there. So really, by limiting to only one of the big mobile standards, you're really limiting the amount that you can distribute your application. So I'd say if at all possible, learn both and distribute for both. All right, so let me turn back to here. You can see what's happening down in the console is it's actually installing netcom hello world.apk. That's actually my application package. So in just a moment here, we're going to see the actual Android device come alive, and we're going to be able to run the Hello World application. So now the Android device has come alive, and we can use this Android device just like a real Android device. And you can see slowly here, the screen is turned black, and in a moment you'll actually see the Hello World application run. It's important to note that this emulator is designed to emulate every possible part of an actual Android device. So here is, for example, the hard keyboard that some Android devices have. Here is the call button and the end button, the button that activates the camera, the volume buttons, etc. All part of Android. Now we also can get a better view of what's going on with our Android if we go into what's called the DDMS perspective. I'm going to open the DDMS perspective, and this is a debug perspective that showed us what's going on with our device. So we can actually take a look at this perspective. I'm going to reset it to its normal layout here. And here is our emulator, and we can actually see the processes that are going on in our emulator. And you can see down here, here's com.netcom.android.webinar. So this is my process that represents my application. And we can see any threads that are actually part of my application as they go on. And if I bring back the emulator, you can see my Hello World from Mark application is running. There is the line, Mark is very good looking. So we've got our application running, and we got it running here in the emulator. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to add a little bit to the actual API itself, or to the application itself, to the UI, and we're going to make this application actually do something. So I'm going to go back to the Java perspective, and we're going to go back into greeting.java. And this is where we're going to write the code, but in the UI, we're going to work in main.xml. And there's actually a GUI we can use for this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the actual GUI here, and I'm going to add to the outline a button. And I just clicked plus, and I'm going to choose the button object here. I'm going to click OK. And it's added the button to the device. It's given it the local name button1, and I can actually set the properties of the button itself. For example, the text that's displayed on the button. So let's open the properties panel. I have to go in here to other, and there's properties. And here are all the properties of the button. We're going to set the text to, there's the ID, button 1. We're going to set the text to, instead of the ID, play music. And you notice as soon as I change that, it changes here in the UI itself. So this button is actually going to play some button. The button is play some music. The button is called button 1. So I'm going to save this new layout. Now notice when I made that change as well, it's added this button here to the XML. Everything that you do in the GUI, the graphic user interfaces, appears in the XML, and everything you do in the XML appears in the GUI. So you can see here, it's created the button with the ID button 1 and the Android text, play music. All right, so that looks good. So now we're going to go back to greeting.java. And what I want to do here is in this onCreate function, which is the function that runs when the actual activity is created, is I want to write the code that's going to cause some music to play. Now before I do that, I've got to give the music or put the music in the application. So I'm going to go here to Resources, and I'm going to add a new folder for raw resources. And I'm going to put in there what's called a MIDI file, which is just a little music file, called journey.midi. And now you can see that's part of the raw folder. And if we were to take a look at r.java, it's added that to the resources automatically. There's journey. Okay, so that's what we're going to play. So the first thing we've got to do is we've got to access the button so we know when the users click the button. So I'm going to create a button object, final. It's of the type button. And this is all Java I'm coding here. Locally, we're going to call it button. Equals, we're going to cast it as a button object. And then I'm going to use find view by ID to actually get the button itself. And here I'm going to get R, remember the R folder, dot. And now it's giving me some drop-down choices here, what type of object I want. In this case, I want the object by ID. And there you'll see there's my button 1. So basically what this line of code says is we are creating a local button object called button, and it's going to be equivalent to that button in the layout that's in the XML. Now the only thing I have to do here is we've got to import the button as part of the imports right here, and Eclipse does that for you automatically. So now that we've got the button, we also have to create a media player object. So that's final, and the type of object is media player. We'll call it MP for short, equals, and then we're going to use the media player static object to create the media player. Now the media player itself requires 2 arguments, a resource ID and a context. Since we haven't passed a context, I'm going to use the getBaseContext method to get the context. The context is just the current application state. And for the resource ID, we've got to point to a resource. Now you'll remember that I put the music itself in journey.mid in the raw resources. So all I've got to do here is access r dot This time it's raw, dot, and there's Journey. So essentially we've loaded a media player with this little bit of music into our program. So now what we've got to do is actually have our program play the media when the button's pressed. So what we want to do is on the button itself, which we've called button, we're going to create a listener. So we're going to use the setOnClickListener method. The setOnClickListener method basically is going to be, look at that button, and anytime that button is clicked, it's going to do something. So what we're going to have it do is we're going to have it run a function. So we're going to create that function, new view dot, helps if I can type, on click listener. And it's automatically going to fill in the code that I need here. And whatever we want it to do, that's going to happen right where my cursor is flashing. So what we're going to do is quite simply is we're going to have the media player start. That'll start playing the music. And we're also going to add a semicolon right here. Now there's one more thing I'm going to do, and that's I'm going to have that text in that text box. If you remember the text box, we look again at main. This text box right here, I'm going to have this text change from Mark is very good looking to a song by Journey. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a string here, and this is the actual text that will appear. String name equals, we'll call it result, a song by Journey. So I've added that string resource. So now in the code itself, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add here that string resources, or excuse me, add the text view so we can access it. So final, and this is going to be a text view object. We'll call it my text. And we're going to, again, cast as a text view the object that we get from the resources. So find view by ID, r dot, and this time we want an ID once again, and it's the ID for button or class. Well, it's not listed here, and that's because we didn't give that text object an ID. So let's go back and do that here in main. I'm going to disconnect from the active emulator, go back to main, and here's our text object, but there's no ID. So we can give it an ID pretty simply. I'm going to copy the ID from button, and I'm going to take it here into the text object. We're going to find the ID right here. I'm going to copy the one from button. Oops, that didn't quite work. Well, we'll just type it in. @ plus ID, and we'll call this text result. All right, we'll save. So this is now called text result, this text area here. So what we're going to do is go back to the code one last time, and we're going to complete this, and now text result is listed. Perfect. So now all we have to do is add the text view to the imports, and it's added the text view of the imports up here. And now we're going to have to write a line of code that'll physically change the text. So that's easy enough to do because we called the text object myText, and we're going to use the setText method, and we're going to set the text now to a resource, r dot, this time it's a string, dot, result. All right, so now we have our completed program. And what we want to do is we want to load this into the emulator and run it. So I'm going to get back to the home screen on the emulator, and I'm going to click my debug, and we'll debug this application. And what's going to happen is it's going to load this application or reload this application into the emulator. And this won't take nearly as long. Let's go to the DDMS perspective. This won't take nearly as long as it did before. So we can actually track what's happening here. And there's our application with the changes appearing. Now, you may or may not be able to hear the music when I play it, but I'll click Play Music. A song by Journey appears. And very faintly in the background, you can probably hear a song by Journey. So that's the demonstration of the actual application. Let me go on to a couple of other things here. I'm going to kill this guy as much as I like Journey. That's an actual demonstration of creating a real Android application that we could easily distribute onto an Android device. And I'm going to come back here into this guy, and I want to give you a sneak peek of the course that we're going to be teaching that goes over everything that is Android. A lot more comprehensive than this, obviously. First of all, the Android course is part of a two-part course. It's the first part. You can either take either part or both. If you take both, it's called Mobile Development Professional. It goes over both Google Android application development and Apple iOS application development. The course is offered in New York City, Las Vegas, and Sterling, Virginia, which is near Dulles Airport outside of Washington, D.C. And the idea here is to take someone who's got some experience with development and bring them to the point where they are a full development professional. Interestingly, as well, we offer beforehand a 3-day course which is designed to prep you from the programming end. If your Java isn't real strong, prep you from the programming end that'll help you get into the actual development. So the program itself, this is the description. The Android platform is the fastest growing mobile development platform in the world, with Android phones being produced by all of the major phone manufacturers. In the addition of the new tablet devices, the platform will only continue to grow. This course will teach application development for the Android device using the Java programming language and the Eclipse development environment, which you just saw. The course will include basic application development, including use of the Android phone, camera, geolocation tools, and playing audio and video files. So the first day of the course, we reinforce all of the Java knowledge necessary for mobile development, creating and running Java apps with Eclipse. We then do data types, variables, and operators, control statements, up to object-oriented Java. In day 2, we dive in with inheritance and interfaces and inner classes, and we create our first Android applications. We also go over all the tools extensively in debugging and profiling Android apps. We then deal with the Android application lifecycle on day 3, dealing with things like interrupts. What if the phone rings? What if there's a text message? We work with application resources, UI fields, buttons, and labels. And then we deal with selection widgets. All of the different elements that become part of the user interface are dealt with on days 3 and 4, including menus and messaging. Then we get into filters and intents, which allows us to switch between different activities, create applications with multiple activities, and work with the internet. On day 5, we deal with XML, the built-in camera, geolocation services, maps, and web services. And then on the final day is a really interesting day. We have animation, audio, and video. We deal with OpenGL, which is great for people who want to start game programming. It's the open graphics library dealing with 2D and 3D. And finally, deploying applications to the application store.